After Star Wars was released, it became apparent that my story, however many films it took to tell, was only one of thousands that could be told about the characters who inhabited its galaxy. But these were not the stories that I was destined to tell. Instead, they would spring from the imagination of other writers, inspired by the glimpse of a galaxy that Star Wars provided. Today, it is an amazing, if unexpected, legacy of Star Wars that so many gifted writers are contributing new stories to that saga. George Lucas, from the introduction of A Splinters of the Mind's Eye, 1996. Welcome back to the Skywalker Files from a Certain Point of View, the podcast where we dive into the forgotten corners and sometimes questionable experiments of the Star Wars expanded universe. I'm your host, Rockwell, and today we're taking a trip to a book that often feels less like a traditional Star Wars adventure and more like a detour into a literary science fiction. It's a novel that dares to ask the important questions, such as what if Anakin Skywalker wasn't just destined to bring balance to the Force, but also destined to test drive a living, organic ship? That's right, we're talking about Rogue Planet, published in 2000 and written by Greg Bear. If you've ever wondered what would happen if you gave a Hugo Award winning hard sci fi author the keys to the galaxy far, far away, this is your answer. The result is strange, fascinating, and occasionally frustrating. Plus, there's a little prophecy in there. Set 3 years after the Phantom Menace, this novel follows a teenage Anakin and his very patient master, Obi-Wan Kenobi, as they travel to the mysterious planet Zonama Sekot, a world where starships are grown rather than built, and where the seeds of the future galactic conflict are already sprouting. In many ways, it feels as a one off curiosity, but in hindsight, it's also one of the earliest breadcrumbs leading to the new Jedi Order and the Yuuzhan Vong invasion that would reshape the expanded universe. So grab your lightsaber, your midi-chlorian count, and perhaps a potted plant for good measure. We're about to journey into Rogue Planet, one of the strangest, boldest experiments of the EU ever attempted. Rogue Planet was published in May of 2000, just a year after the release of The Phantom Menace. At this point, in the EU, Lucasfilm and Del Rey were still in the early stages of their bold new publishing initiative, the New Jedi Order series. This massive project was intended to push Star Wars storytelling into unfamiliar territory with darker themes, a galaxy spanning war, and entirely new villains. And to set the stage for that seismic shift, Del Rey turned to Greg Bear. Now, Bear was not your typical tie-in novelist. By this point, he was already a celebrated science fiction author with awards to his name and a reputation for big idea storytelling. Genetics, artificial intelligence, deep time, and the philosophy of what makes life, well, life. Bringing him into Star Wars was a deliberate choice, an attempt to inject something different into the prequel era, something that reflected George Lucas's newfound interest in the living force and biological themes. The novel itself is set roughly 3 years after The Phantom Menace. That places it in a relatively quiet moment of galactic history, before the Separatist Crisis, before the Clone Wars, and long before Anakin had worked out exactly what kind of Jedi he was going to be. The Jedi Order, at least on the surface, is still at peace. But Rogue Planet is less about galactic politics and more about testing both Anakin and Obi-Wan in the crucible of an unknown world. Perhaps most importantly, the book introduces Zonama Sekot, a planet that is as much a character as anyone else. At the time, it may have seemed like an odd detour, but for readers who stuck with the EU long enough to reach the New Jedi Order, it became clear that this was no throwaway experiment. Rogue Planet was laying the groundwork for a conflict unlike anything Star Wars had seen before. At the heart of Rogue Planet is the very particular snapshot of two familiar figures, Obi-Wan Kenobi and his young apprentice, Anakin Skywalker. But what makes this novel fascinating is how it captures them in a moment of transition, before the characters we know from the films had fully taken shape. Now, in The Phantom Menace, Obi-Wan was still very much the dutiful Padawan, suddenly elevated to the rank of Jedi Knight after the death of Qui-Gon. In Rogue Planet, we finally see him stepping into the uncomfortable shoes of mentor. He's cautious, patient, and at times overwhelmed by the responsibility of guiding someone like Anakin. Greg Bear paints Obi-Wan as a man who is doing his best to uphold Jedi tradition, while also realizing that his apprentice is anything but traditional. His inner tension, wanting to honor Qui-Gon's legacy while keeping Anakin in line. It adds quite the undercurrent of drama to the novel. Meanwhile, Anakin here is only 12 years old, still a boy on the edge of adolescence. But he's already showing signs of the Anakin we'll come to know. He's restless, defiant, headstrong, and deeply in tune to the Force in ways that are making the Jedi uneasy. He's struggling with nightmares, with the feeling of isolation, and with an intensity that even Obi-Wan can't quite understand. Yet he's still a child. He's curious, excitable, and at times naive. This blend of innocence and power is what makes his portrayal in Rogue Planet so compelling. We're not yet seeing the fallen hero of the prequels. We're seeing the cracks start to form in the foundation, though. Then there's Vergray, a name that will become much more important later in the expanded universe. In this novel, she appears almost as a mysterious side note, an enigmatic Fosh Jedi who had vanished decades earlier and is now tangled up in the strange world of Zonama Sekot. At the time of publication, she was little more than an exotic curiosity. But for the longtime readers, her inclusion would later become a huge deal, since she played a pivotal, controversial role in the New Jedi Order series. Here she's a riddle wrapped in feathers, and Greg Bear wisely keeps her enigmatic. Finally, we must talk about Zonama Sekot itself. Rarely does Star Wars setting feel so alive, because in this case, it is literally alive. The planet is symbiotic, responsive, and brimming with a kind of organic consciousness. Its signature creation, the living starships that bond with their pilots, is as much a test of character as it is a means of travel. For Anakin, the encounter with Zonama Sekot is more than just an adventure. It's a confrontation with the Force in its rawest, strangest form. In truth, the planet functions almost like a third main character, shaping the story as much as Obi-Wan or Anakin. Together, these characters, Master, Apprentice, Mystery Jedi, and Living World, set the stage for a story that is less about lightsaber duels and more about the questions of destiny, identity, and nature of life itself. The story begins in relatively familiar territory, the Jedi Council sending Obi-Wan and Anakin on a mission. Their destination, however, is anything but typical. They're dispatched to Zonama Sekot, a remote and little understood planet at the edge of the galaxy, famed for its unique ability to grow starships. For the Jedi, it's an opportunity for Anakin to face a challenge, to learn patience and control. For Anakin, naturally, it's the opportunity to show off. Upon arrival, the pair discover that Zonama Sekot is not merely a planet, but a kind of organism in its own right, responsive, symbiotic, and aware. Here, Individuals can cultivate a starship by forming a bond with the planet's life forms, resulting in a vessel that is literally alive. Anakin, ever the prodigy, excels at this process, and his interactions with the world push him deeper into the mysteries of the Force, but they also hint at a dangerous intensity of his gifts. Of course, not all is peaceful. The corporate villainy of Wraith Sinir, an ambitious starship designer with ties to future Imperial projects, provides the story's more traditional antagonist. Zinir represents the galaxy's fascination with technology and control, set in deliberate contrast to Zonama Sekot's organic symbiotic philosophy. The conflict escalates when Zinir and his associates attempt to seize the planet's secrets, and Obi-Wan and Anakin are drawn into defending Zonama Sekot. The climax sees the planet itself respond in a startling way, choosing to disappear from known space entirely, effectively removing itself from the galactic stage until it reemerges much later in the expanded universe. This act underscores the central theme that life, in all its complexity, resists control. Unlike most Star Wars novels of its era, Rogue Planet often feels contemplative, even alien. There's less emphasis on fast paced battles and more on strange landscapes, inner struggles, and the encounters with the unknown. Greg Bear's prose lingers on details: planets that glow with intelligence, starships that breathe, and the Force that feels less like a tool and more like a living mystery. It's Star Wars seen through the lens of literary science fiction. At its core, the novel wrestles with a few recurring ideas: the nature of life and the Force. Zonoma Sekot embodies the concept of the living Force, an ecosystem that defies simple categorization and reflects George Lucas's own prequel era fascination with biology and symbiosis. Then there's destiny versus control. Anakin's journey is framed by his desire to master his own path, even as Obi-Wan and the Jedi Council try to shape him. Zonoma Sekot doesn't give him a mystery, it tests him, mirrors him, and leaves him unsettled. Finally, there's technology versus nature. Wraith Sinir's cold pursuit of engineered perfection clashes with organic unpredictability of Zonoma Sekot. This tension foreshadows the wider galactic conflict between the rigid systems and the living beings. In short, the plot isn't about galactic wars or Sith conspiracies. It's about a boy, his master, and a living planet, each trying to understand what role they will play in a future none of them can yet see. At the time of its release, Rogue Planet may have seemed like a curious little side adventure. Anakin's awkward pre-training road trip with Obi-Wan, punctuated by some organic starship shopping, but in hindsight, it's astonishing just how much connective tissue Greg Bear wove into the expanded universe, some of which wouldn't pay off until years later. First and foremost, the biggest legacy of Rogue Planet is Zonoma Sekot. Readers in 2000 couldn't have known it, but this strange living world would become a pivotal element in the new Jedi Order series. By the time the Yuuzhan Vong invasion began in 1999's Vector Prime, the seeds had already been planted here. Zonoma Sekot, with its organic starships and symbiotic philosophy, was not just a curiosity, it was a direct narrative echo of the Vong's own biotech culture. Eventually, it would even be revealed that the planet had ties to their extragalactic origins. So, while the book may have looked like a detour at the time, it was actually foreshadowing one of the EU's most ambitious arcs. Then there's Vergray. Her appearance in this novel is almost casual, a bit of a background strangeness for the casual reader to note. But in the long game, the expanded universe, this was a crucial move. Decades later, Vergray would become one of the most divisive figures in Star Wars storytelling. A mentor of sorts to Jason Solo during the Yuuzhan Vong War, a philosopher who challenged the very foundations of Jedi orthodoxy. Her presence here on Zonoma Sekot helped give her eventual role of an air of consistency, even if Greg Bear himself had no idea where the character would eventually end up. On a smaller scale, Rogue Planet was connected to the prequels through Wraith Senior. At first glance, he's just another corporate schemer, but expanded universe lore ties him to the development of technologies that will later empower the Empire. His designs lead to the early concepts of the TIE Fighter, and he even has hands on the Death Star. In that sense, his clash with Zonama Sekot becomes a symbolic foreshadowing of the galaxy's eventual choice between living balance and mechanical domination. Finally, there's Anakin himself. The novel gives us a rare glimpse of him as a boy between the films. Before the romance, before the anger, before the war. His journey on Zonoma Sekot highlights both his raw potential and his volatility, echoing the duality that will define his future. For readers of the expanded universe, this novel quietly reinforced the idea that Anakin's destiny was never going to be simple, and his relationship with the Force was always going to be complicated. Taken together, these threads make Rogue Planet far more significant than its quiet reputation suggests. It's not just an odd experiment. It's a stepping stone towards some of the EU's most ambitious storytelling. When Rogue Planet first hit shelves in 2000, it didn't exactly set the fandom on fire. Many readers expecting a fast-paced lightsaber duel, Sith conspiracy, or pod racing rematch found themselves instead in the middle of a slow burn, philosophical science fiction story. It was alien, introspective, and in some places strange even by Star Wars standards. As a result, it quietly drifted into obscurity, overshadowed by much more explosive New Jedi Order books that followed soon after. But with distance, the novel reveals its strengths. Greg Bear brought something very few expanded universe authors did: a literary, conceptual style. His focus wasn't on blaster battles, but on themes of life, growth, destiny. He gave us a rare, thoughtful look at a young Anakin Skywalker, before war and romance consumed his narrative. He gave Obi-Wan space to be a teacher, to struggle, to grow into the man who would one day face down his own apprentice on Mustafar. And perhaps most importantly, he planted the seeds of the Yuuzhan Vong saga years before it bloomed. In hindsight, Rogue Planet feels less like a misstep and more like a curious puzzle piece, one that only makes sense once you see the larger picture. It may not be the most action packed or beloved expanded universe novel, but it dared to do something different, and that alone makes it worth revisiting. If nothing else, it reminds us that Star Wars is big enough to hold more than just space battles and galactic politics. It can also be about a living planet, organic starships, and the uneasy relationship between a boy, his master, and the mysteries of the Force. And in that sense, Rogue Planet is very much in line with the saga's central idea that life itself, in all its strange and wondrous forms, is at the heart of the story. And that brings us to the end of our journey through Rogue Planet. It's an odd little corner of the expanding universe, sometimes overlooked, sometimes misunderstood, but undeniably important in ways that only became clear years later. Whether you see it as an ambitious experiment or a slow detour, it reminds us that the expanded universe was never afraid to take risks, even if it meant making readers scratch their heads along the way. Next time, we're leaving behind the organic starships and philosophical world building for something a bit more gritty. We'll be diving into Dark Horse's comic arc Twilight, a story that puts Jedi Master Quillen Voss front and center. This tale of betrayal, corruption, and identity in the criminal underworld of Nar Shaddaa feels very different from Rogue Planet, but it carries its own weight in shaping the Jedi mythos during the prequel era. So join me as we step into the shadows of Twilight, where loyalties are tested, the line between light and dark blurs, and Quillen Vos begins a journey that will mark him as one of the EU's most fascinating Jedi. Until then, this has been the Skywalker Files from a certain point of view with your host, Rockwell. May the living force be with you, preferably one that doesn't require you to grow your own starship in your backyard.